When Peter was 12, his father took him to the storage pit cut into the bank behind their house in Norway. The old man crouched beside the turf-lined wall, candlelight catching the beads of moisture on the packed earth, and pressed his palm flat against it. "Feel," he said. Peter touched the wall. It was cool in summer. In winter, it was almost warm. "The earth does not swing with the air," his father said. "Remember that." 20 years later, standing on a treeless prairie with a widowed sister, a 6-year-old nephew, and not enough lumber to build a proper house before winter, Peter remembered. Peter Lunde had arrived in Custer County in August of 1887 with less than he had planned and more than he could carry. The train had deposited him and his sister at a depot that was little more than a platform and a sign. Marit held Elias by the hand while Peter counted what remained of their money. $62. It had been 90 in Sioux City. The difference had gone to a filing agent, a night's lodging, and a freighter who promised to haul their trunk and stove fittings to the claim. The claim itself was a rectangle of grass that looked like every other rectangle of grass for miles in every direction. A surveyor's stake marked one corner. The wind moved through it without slowing. Peter walked the boundaries while Marit stood with Elias near the trunk. He paced the distance, 160 acres. It sounded like wealth when spoken aloud in Iowa. Here it looked like a problem stated in land instead of numbers. No trees, no creek within sight, no shelter except a half-collapsed dugout left by whoever had abandoned this claim before. He had known there would be no trees. The land office agent in Sioux City had warned him, but knowing and seeing were different acts. In Norway, in the valley where he had grown up, trees crowded the slopes so thick a man could not walk straight through them. Here the horizon bent around him like the rim of a bowl, and the only vertical lines were the grass stems bending in the wind. Marit walked over to him. Elias trailed behind, dragging a stick through the dirt. "Where's the house?" Elias asked. Peter looked at the collapsed dugout. The roof had fallen in. Grass grew through the gap. "We will build one," he said. The words came out easier than the math behind them. He had $62. He needed lumber for framing, boards for walls, shingles or sod for roofing, a stove, stovepipe, nails, rope, hinges, a door. He needed food for 3 people through a winter he had never experienced. He needed firewood in a place where no trees grew, which meant he needed to buy cut wood and haul it, or buy coal and haul that, or find something else entirely. He needed, in other words, more than he had. The freighter arrived 3 days late with the trunk and stove fittings. His name was Gunderson, and he spoke Norwegian with a Bergen accent that made Marit smile for the first time since they had left Iowa. "The crossing washed out," Gunderson said. "Had to go around. Lost half a day. The boards you ordered." He paused. "They got wet. Some of them warped. The supplier says he cannot replace them." Peter climbed into the wagon bed and looked at the lumber. 8 boards were twisted. 2 were cracked. The rest would serve, but the rest was not enough. He had ordered 40 boards. He had 30 that were usable. How much would it cost to replace the damaged ones? Gunderson shook his head. "Lumber prices went up last month. 12 cents a foot now. Used to be 9. Peter did the math. Replacing the boards would cost more than he had left after the filing fee and food calculations. The numbers closed like a door. "I will make do," he said. Gunderson looked at the land around them. The wind pressed the grass flat and then released it. "You have kin nearby? Someone to help you build before the cold?" "No." "Friends?" "No." Gunderson climbed back onto the wagon seat. He gathered the reins and then paused. "There is a man named Ezra Bell who knows this country. Freighted through it for 20 years. If you have questions about what a winter here can do, ask him. He will tell you straight." He flicked the reins. "Whether you want to hear it or not." Pater found Ezra Bell at the supply yard in Broken Bow, loading salt pork into a crate. Bell was a tall man with a face like leather stretched over bone. His hands were scarred across the knuckles. He moved slowly, but every movement finished exactly where he intended it to finish. "Gunderson sent me," Pater said. Bell looked up. His eyes moved over Pater the way a man might examine a piece of equipment before deciding whether to buy it. "The Norwegian on the Hendricks claim?" "Yes. What do you need?" "Advice on building before winter." Bell set down the salt pork. He wiped his hands on his trousers and walked around the crate until he stood close enough for Pater to see the deep lines around his eyes. "You have lumber?" "Some. 30 usable boards." "How big a house?" 16 by 20. Bell made a sound in his throat that was not quite a laugh. 30 boards for a 16 by 20? In this country? "I know it is not enough. I am asking what else I can do." "You can leave." Bell said it without cruelty. He said it the way a man might tell another man that a horse was lame. "Go back to Iowa. Get work through the winter. Come back in spring with money and a proper crew." "I cannot leave. I have a sister and her boy with me. We have no money for passage back. The claim requires residence to prove up." "Then you have a problem that advice cannot fix." Bell walked past him toward the yard office. Pater followed. "What would you need? If you were me, what would be the minimum to survive a winter here?" Bell stopped. He turned. "A dry roof, 6 good walls worth of timber, a stove that draws, enough firewood to keep it burning from November to March." He counted on his fingers. "That is 4 months, on a bad year 5. You would need 8 cords of wood to be safe, 10 to be comfortable. Can you cut 8 cords?" "There is no timber on the claim." "Then you would have to haul it. 20 miles to the nearest stand worth cutting. How many trips can you make before the ground freezes?" Pater did not answer. Bell's eyes stayed on him. "You have a sister and a boy depending on you. Keep them in a half-finished shack with 30 boards and no fuel. You will freeze them from the floor up. The cold here does not argue. It does not give warnings. It comes in January like a wall falling, and whatever you have built is what you have built." He turned and walked into the yard office. The conversation was over. Pater walked the claim that evening with Marit while Elias slept in the tent they had pitched near the collapsed dugout. The sun dropped toward the horizon, and the light turned the grass gold, and then brown, and then gray. "What did the freighter's friend say?" Marit asked. "That we should leave." "Can we?" "No." She was quiet for a moment. The wind pushed her hair across her face, and she gathered it with one hand. "Then we stay." "He said I would freeze you and Elias, from the floor up." Marit stopped walking. She looked at him. "Our father said something to you once. Do you remember? When you were helping him with the storage pit behind the house. You told me about it after." Pater remembered. He had been 12. His father had taken him to see the pit where they kept crocks of butter and milk cool in summer, where vegetables stayed crisp into winter. The pit was cut into a bank, lined with turf, roofed with poles and sod. His father had put his hand against the wall. "The earth does not swing with the air," Pater said. "That is what you told me," he said. "It was just a storage pit. And this is just grass. But underneath the grass is earth. And underneath the earth," she spread her hands, "what is underneath?" Pater looked at the collapsed dugout, at the grass growing through the fallen roof, at the walls that had been cut into the ground and were still standing, still holding their shape, while the part above had rotted and fallen in. "More earth," he said. He began digging the next morning. The plan formed in his mind as he worked. He would not build a house that stood entirely above the ground. He would sink it, 4 feet down. The earth walls would replace timber walls for the lower portion. He would use his 30 boards for the upper structure, the roof frame, the door. He would bank the exposed upper walls with sod. He would make the prairie itself into half the house. It was not a new idea. Men had built dugouts before, but a true dugout was a hole in a hillside, a cave with a front wall. This claim had no hillside. The land was flat. He would have to excavate a pit and build up from it. He marked the corners with stakes, 16 by 20 feet. He began cutting the sod in squares and stacking them to the side. Beneath the sod was dark earth, packed hard by centuries of roots. He swung the spade and the blade bit an inch deep, swung again and another inch fell away. At this rate, it would take a month just to reach the full depth. Marit brought him water at noon. Elias stood at the edge of the marked rectangle watching. "What are you building?" Elias asked. "A house." "It does not look like a house." "Not yet. Houses go up. You are going down." Peter drove the spade into the earth and leaned on the handle. His shoulders ached. His palms were already raw. "This house will do both," he said. Jonas Mercer came by on the 4th day of digging. He was a neighbor 2 miles east, a man with a wife and 2 grown sons who had been on his claim for 3 years. His house was above ground, board-framed, the kind of structure Peter could not afford to build. Mercer stood at the edge of the excavation and watched Peter work. "You are going deep," he said. 4 feet. "Why?" Peter climbed out of the pit. He was standing in a hole now, waist deep, surrounded by stacked sod and mounded dirt. "The earth stays warmer than the air in winter, cooler in summer. If I put half the house below grade, I need less timber for walls and less fuel for heat." Mercer scratched his jaw. He was a practical man, not an unkind one. His doubt showed in his eyes, not his voice. "If you sink it, it will sweat. Moisture from the ground, it will drip from the walls, soak into everything. If it sweats, it will rot. The timbers, the roof, anything would. And if it rots," he shrugged, "you will dig once and bury yourself twice. I will line the walls, slope the floor for drainage, cut a diversion trench upslope." "Have you done this before?" "No." Mercer nodded slowly. The admission did not surprise him. "The idea is not stupid," he said. "The earth does hold warmth. I have seen it in storm cellars. But a storm cellar is not a house. You do not live in it through a winter. You do not cook in it, sleep in it, keep a child in it for months." "I do not have a choice." Mercer looked at the pit, at the stakes marking the corners, at the stacked sod. "No," he said, "I suppose you do not." He left without offering to help. Peter did not blame him. A man with his own family, his own claim, his own preparations to make, could not spend days digging another man's hole. But the doubt stayed with him as he worked. Sweat, rot, bury yourself twice. The hostile skeptic came on the 7th day. Silas Rourke owned the lumberyard in Broken Bow and ran a side business selling supplies on credit to desperate homesteaders. The credit came with interest. The interest came with teeth. Men who could not pay found their claims bought out from under them for a fraction of their value. Rourke rode out to the claim on a gray horse. He wore a town coat and a clean hat, and he looked at the excavation the way a man might look at a body he was waiting to bury. "The Norwegian," he said without dismounting. Peter climbed out of the pit. He was 4 feet down now across half the footprint. His hands were blistered. His back felt like a rope that had been twisted and then released. "Rourke, I heard you were building something unusual. I had to see it for myself." Rourke smiled. It did not reach his eyes. "You are digging a cellar." "I am digging a house." "A house." Rourke shifted in the saddle. "With half your lumber warped and the other half not enough to frame a proper wall, with no timber on the claim and no money to haul firewood 20 miles, with a widow sister and a boy who will cough through the first hard freeze." He leaned forward. That is not a house. That is a grave with a roof. It will hold. Will it? Bell says you will freeze from the floor up. Mercer says you will sweat and rot. And I say, Rourke patted his coat pocket, I say I can offer you terms. Lumber on credit, coal on credit, everything you need to build a proper house, the way proper houses are built on this prairie. Pay me back in spring with the first crop, or sign over half the claim as collateral. Pater felt the offer like a hand closing around his throat. Half the claim, 160 acres shrunk to 80. The filing fee wasted, the dream halved. No. No? Rourke's smile widened. You would rather die in a hole than owe me money? I would rather live in a house I built than owe a debt I cannot pay. Rourke pulled the reins. The horse turned. I will ask again in October, and again in November. And when the first real cold comes, when your sister's crying and the boy is sick and the fire is not enough, he tipped his hat. I will ask again. He rode away. The sound of the hooves faded into the wind. Marit came out of the tent. She had heard everything. He will come back, she said. Yes. What will you tell him? Pater picked up the spade. His blisters screamed. He ignored them. The same thing, every time. The first setback came the next week. Pater had dug the pit to full depth across the entire footprint, 4 feet down, 16 by 20 feet wide. The walls were vertical, cut clean, packed solid. He was ready to begin setting the posts for the upper frame. Then the rain came. It was not a storm. It was not even a hard rain. It was a steady drizzle that lasted 2 days and turned the excavation into a pond. Water seeped through the walls. It pooled at the bottom. By the second morning, 6 inches of brown water covered the floor. Pater stood at the edge and stared at it. Sweat, Mercer had said. It will drip from the walls. This was not sweat. This was the earth drinking rain and pushing it into the lowest point it could find, which was now the house Pater was building. Marit came up beside him. Can you drain it? I should have drained it before I dug, cut a trench upslope, diverted the runoff. He shook his head. I did not think of it. I was too focused on depth. Can you cut the trench now? Yes, but the damage is done. The walls are wet. They will need to dry before I can trust them. That is days lost, maybe a week. He climbed down into the water. It came up to his knees. Cold, brown. The bottom was mud now, not packed earth. He began bailing with a bucket. Scoop, climb, dump. Scoop, climb, dump. After an hour, the water level had dropped an inch. Marit took the bucket from him. I will bail. You cut the trench. You cannot. I can bail water. I have done harder work than this. She climbed down into the pit. Her skirt soaked through instantly. She did not flinch. Go. Pater went. He cut the trench with the last of his strength, working uphill from the excavation, angling the channel to carry runoff away from the pit instead of toward it. It was the kind of work that should have been done first, the kind of work a man who knew this land would have known to do. He did not know this land. He was learning it by making mistakes. The water drained over the next 2 days. The walls dried slowly in the autumn air. But when Pater examined them, he found what he had feared, crumbling along the upper edges. The rain had softened the earth, and the softened earth had sloughed in places, widening the pit unevenly. He would have to cut the walls again, shave them back to solid earth. That meant the footprint would shrink, 15 by 19 instead of 16 by 20, smaller inside, tighter. Will it still work? Marit asked. Pater looked at the walls, the stacked sod, the lumber waiting to be lifted into place. It has to, he said. Have you ever been mocked for building the only solution you could afford? Tell us in the comments. The man appeared at the edge of the excavation on a gray October afternoon. He was older than Pater, somewhere near 50, with a face weathered to the color of old wood and hands that looked like they had been rebuilt multiple times from accidents. He stood with his weight on his heels, studying the pit the way a man might study a piece of ground before deciding where to dig. "You are wrong in the 3 places," he said. Peter climbed out of the hole. He had been repairing the sloughed wall all morning, and his arms felt like dead weight. "Who are you?" "August Kroll. I dig wells, storm cellars, anything that goes into the ground instead of on top of it." He nodded toward the pit. "I heard about the Norwegian who was building a house like a grave. I had to see what kind of fool would try it." "And now you have seen." "Yes." Kroll walked around the excavation slowly, examining it from different angles. "Your cut lines are too steep near the top. Earth needs to rest against something, or it slumps. You need to angle the upper foot outward, give it a shelf to sit on. That is one." Peter said nothing. He watched. "Your drainage trench is pointed wrong. Water does not run in the direction you hope. It runs in the direction the ground tells it. You have the trench aimed at flat land. Flat land holds water. You need to aim it at the low spot 300 feet west, where the ground dips toward the draw. That is 2. And 3? Kroll pointed at the stacked lumber. "Your posts. You're going to set them in the dirt floor. Dirt holds moisture. Moisture rots posts. In 2 years, your frame will be soft. In 3, it will fail." He turned to face Peter directly. "You need stones under the posts, flat stones or bricks if you can get them, something to lift the wood away from the earth." "I do not have stones, or bricks, or money for bricks. There is a creek bed 4 miles north, flat stones the size of your hand. Free for the hauling." Kroll shrugged. "If you have time." "Do I have time?" Kroll looked at the sky. The clouds were moving fast from the northwest. First hard freeze is usually late October, sometimes early November. You have maybe 4 weeks to get walls up and a roof on, less if the weather turns early. He looked back at the pit. "You are wrong in 3 places, but you are right in the only place that matters." "What place is that?" "You're not building against the prairie. You're building with it. The earth is warmer than the air. The earth is steadier. A man who understands that can survive where a man who fights it will die." He paused. "I have seen your kind of thinking before. Not often. Most men build tall and burn hot and pray the fuel holds out. But some men," he shook his head, "some men listen to the ground." "Will you help me?" The question came out before Peter could stop it. He had not planned to ask. He barely knew this man. But the knowledge Kroll carried was the knowledge Peter lacked, and the stakes did not allow for pride. Kroll studied him for a long moment. "I have work of my own, wells to finish before freeze up, but I can show you the 3 fixes, and maybe—" He looked at the sky again. "Maybe I can check on you as I pass, point out what you're doing wrong before it kills you." "Why would you do that?" "Because you're not building a grave. Rourke is wrong about that. You're building a shelter, and a man who is building a shelter, even badly, is a man worth helping." He started walking toward the drainage trench. "Come, I'll show you how water actually moves." The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of labor. Peter recut the upper walls with the angle Kroll had shown him. He redirected the drainage trench toward the low ground to the west. He made 3 trips to the creek bed and hauled back flat stones in the wagon he had borrowed from Jonas Mercer, who still did not believe the house would work, but who was willing to lend equipment to a man who was clearly going to try regardless. The posts went up first. 6 main posts sunk into holes dug into the pit floor, each resting on a flat stone, each braced with smaller stones packed around the base. Then the cross beams. Then the ridgepole. Then the wall frames for the upper portion, the part of the house that would rise above the prairie surface. Peter used every usable board he had. 30 pieces of lumber, measured and cut and fitted and nailed until there was nothing left but scraps. The upper walls rose 3 feet above grade, not tall, not impressive, but vertical and his. August Kroll came by twice during those weeks. The first time he found a flaw in the roof pitch, too shallow, it would hold snow instead of shedding it, and made Peter tear out 2 days of work to fix it. The second time, he brought something Peter had not expected, a length of stovepipe he had salvaged from a collapsed claim 20 miles east. The man who built there died in '84, Kroll said. The pipe is good. No one claimed it. Now you have. What do I owe you? Show me you can survive a winter. That is payment enough. The stove went in on the last day of October. It was a small box stove, cast iron, rusted in places but functional. Peter had bought it in Sioux City for $11. It had survived the wagon accident that warped the lumber, and now it sat in the corner of the sunken house, its pipe rising through the low roof, ready to burn whatever fuel Peter could find. The house was not finished. The sod banking on the upper walls was only half done. The door was a piece of canvas nailed over the opening. The floor was packed dirt with drainage grooves cut into it. The roof was poles and brush and sod, not tight enough to keep out all the weather. But it was enclosed. For the first time since they had arrived on the claim, Peter, Marit, and Elias could sleep somewhere with walls around them and a roof above them. That night, Peter lit the first fire. The smoke rose through the pipe. The heat spread through the small room. Marit sat on a crate with Elias in her lap, watching the flames. It is warm, Elias said. It will be warmer, Peter said, when the banking is done, when the walls are sealed. He did not know if that was true. He was guessing. He was hoping. But the fire burned, and the room was warmer than the tent had been, and outside the wind was rising, and for one night at least they were sheltered. Ezra Bell came the next morning. He rode a bay mare and wore a heavy coat that made him look even larger than he was. He dismounted at the edge of the claim and walked toward the sunken house without greeting anyone. When he reached the pit, he stopped and looked at what Peter had built. The upper walls rose from the ground like the top half of a box. The sod banking climbed partway up the exposed boards. The stovepipe poked through the low roof, wisping smoke. From this angle, the house looked like a structure that had sunk into the earth and was still sinking. "So you did it," Bell said. Peter was on the roof, layering sod. He climbed down. "I did what I could." "What you could." Bell walked around the structure slowly. His eyes missed nothing. "The cut is good, better than I expected. The banking will help if you finish it. The pitch is steep enough to shed snow." He stopped at the doorway and looked inside. The interior was dim. The fire had burned down to coals. Marit was cooking something that smelled like turnips and salt pork. "It is warm," Bell said. His voice carried a note of surprise. "The earth holds heat, or it does not lose it as fast as the air. I know the theory. Everyone knows the theory. I have seen dugouts dug into hillsides that stay warm. But this," he gestured at the flat land around them, "this is not a hillside. You dug a hole in flat ground." "Yes." "And you expect it to hold heat through a winter." "I expect it to hold heat better than a house built entirely above ground with the same amount of lumber." Bell turned to face him. His eyes were hard, assessing. "You have maybe 3 cords of wood stacked behind the house. I saw it when I rode up. 3 cords is nothing. That is 6 weeks if you are careful, 8 if you freeze. How do you expect to heat this place from November to March on 3 cords? The earth helps. The banking helps. The low profile catches less wind. I will need less fire to maintain the same warmth." "And if you are wrong?" Peter did not answer. Bell nodded slowly. Keep your sister and that boy in a half-buried shack if you want. But when the real cold hits, not the cold we have now, the real cold, you will freeze them from the floor up. Mark my words." He walked back to his mare and mounted. "I hope I am wrong," he said. "I have buried too many people who thought they knew better than this country. I hope you are not one more." He rode away. Marit came to the doorway. What did he say? Peter looked at the 3 cords of wood, at the half-finished banking, at the canvas door that let in drafts every time the wind gusted. "That we will freeze." "Will we?" He turned to face her. "I do not know." The wind rose. The canvas door flapped. Somewhere beyond the horizon, winter was building. November came with teeth. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a single night. Peter woke to frost on the inside of the canvas door and his breath visible in the dim light. The fire had burned down to ash. The stove was cold. He rebuilt the fire quickly, feeding it kindling and then small splits until the heat began to spread. Marit stirred on her pallet. Elias coughed once and pulled his blanket tighter. The banking. He had to finish the banking. He had been working on it for a week, cutting sod from the prairie and stacking it against the upper walls. The technique was simple but slow. Each piece of sod had to be cut thick enough to hold together, carried to the house, and fitted against the boards at an angle that would shed water and hold warmth. August Kroll had shown him how to stagger the pieces so the seams did not align, how to pack dirt into the gaps, how to slope the outer surface so rain would run off instead of soaking in. But the work took time, and time was the one thing Peter did not have. He stepped outside. The wind was sharper than yesterday. The grass was white with frost. To the east, the sun rose orange through a haze of cold, and the light made the prairie look like it was burning. He had maybe 2 weeks of decent weather left, maybe less. The banking was half done. The door was still canvas. The floor needed another layer of packed earth to seal the drainage grooves. The gaps around the stovepipe needed sealing with mud and straw. 2 weeks, maybe less. He picked up the spade and began cutting sod. August Kroll arrived at mid-morning with a mule and a cartload of something covered with canvas. "Willow brush," he said, pulling back the cover. "Cut it from the creek bottom last week. Was going to use it for a well cap, but the man who hired me died before I finished. His widow does not want the well. She does not want the brush either." Peter looked at the pile. Willow branches, thin and flexible, stripped of leaves. "What do I do with it?" "You weave it." Kroll climbed down from the cart. "Between the roof poles, under the sod. It creates a layer that holds the dirt in place and keeps it from sifting down into the room. Your roof will shed less dirt. It will also shed more water." "Show me." Kroll showed him. They worked together for the rest of the day, pulling the existing sod off the roof section by section, weaving willow brush between the poles in a tight crosshatch pattern, then relaying the sod on top. The work was tedious and cold. Peter's hands cramped around the branches, but when they finished one section and tested it by pushing against the sod from below, nothing fell through. The brush held. "This is what you do for wells?" Peter asked. "For well caps, for storm cellars, for anything that needs to hold dirt without letting it fall." Kroll wiped his hands on his trousers. A man who works with earth learns that earth wants to move. It wants to settle, to shift, to fall. Your job is to convince it to stay where you put it. "How long have you done this work?" "Since I came to this country. 22 years. Before that, I worked in the mines in Pennsylvania. Before that, in Germany, moving earth for the railroads." He looked at the house, at the banking, at the roof. Earth is the same everywhere. It follows the same rules. The difference is whether you learn the rules or fight them. "And this house?" Does it follow the rules? Kroll was quiet for a moment. It follows some of them. You have learned fast, faster than most. But there are rules you have not learned yet, and the winter will teach them to you whether you are ready or not. What rules? Ventilation, smoke, the way air moves when everything is sealed tight. He pointed at the stovepipe. That pipe will draw when the fire is hot, but when the fire burns low, or when the wind hits from certain directions, the draw will fail. Smoke will back into the room. You will choke on it or open the door to clear it, and then you will lose all your heat. What do I do? You add a vent, a small opening near the floor on the side away from the wind. It lets air in without letting heat out. The draft feeds the fire from below, and the smoke goes up instead of into the room. Show me. Kroll showed him. They cut a small hole in the lower wall on the south side, shielded it with a piece of board that could be opened or closed, and angled it so wind could not blow directly through. It was simple. It was obvious now that Peter saw it, but he would never have thought of it himself. What else do I not know? He asked. Kroll looked at him. His eyes were not unkind, but they were not soft either. Everything. You do not know everything. No one does. The difference between a man who survives and a man who dies is not knowledge. It is the willingness to keep learning when the learning costs you everything you thought you knew. He climbed back onto the cart. I will come by again before the deep cold, if I can. Thank you. Kroll nodded. He flicked the reins, and the mule pulled the cart away. Peter stood in the cold and watched him go. The wind cut through his coat. The sun was already past its peak, and the shadows were long on the frost-white grass. Everything. He did not know everything. He went back to work. The second setback came the following week. Elias fell sick. It started with a cough that would not stop, then a fever that made his skin hot to the touch, then a weakness that kept him on his pallet, unable to stand without swaying. Marit nursed him through the days, feeding him broth and water, keeping him warm under every blanket they had. Peter worked outside as long as he could, then came in to take over so Marit could rest. The house was warm enough with the fire burning high, but burning high meant burning fast, and burning fast meant the woodpile shrank. 2.5 cords left, maybe 2 weeks of fuel if he kept the fire low, less than a week if he kept it high for a sick child. On the third day of the sickness, Jonas Mercer came by with a small bundle wrapped in cloth. My wife made these, he said, handing the bundle to Peter. Herb poultices, for the chest. She heard the boy was sick. Peter looked at the bundle. He had not asked for help. He had not expected it. Thank you. Do not thank me. Thank my wife. She is a soft woman, softer than this country requires. Mercer looked at the house. The banking was nearly finished now. The canvas door had been replaced with a frame of boards covered in stitched hides. You have made progress. Some. It looks more like a house than a grave now. Still low, still strange, but... He shrugged, less likely to be mistaken for a burial. High praise. Mercer almost smiled. I still think it will sweat. I still think you will regret going so deep. But I have been wrong before. He looked at the stovepipe, at the thin stream of smoke rising into the gray sky. How is your wood holding? 2.5 cords. Mercer was quiet for a moment. That is not enough. I know. What will you do? Peter looked at the prairie. The grass was brown now, flattened by frost and wind. The sky was heavy with clouds that promised snow, but had not yet delivered it. I will burn less. I will seal the house tighter. I will use the earth to do what the fire cannot. And if that is not enough, then I will burn the furniture, the packing crates, the wagon boards, anything that burns. Mercer nodded slowly. If you need more wood, I can spare maybe half a cord, but I cannot spare more. My own family needs the rest. Half a cord would help. I will bring it tomorrow. Mercer turned to leave, then stopped. The boy. Is he bad? I do not know. The fever is high. But he's young. Young ones fight. They do. They also die. Mercer's voice was quiet. My first daughter died in '82. Fever in the winter. We could not get to a doctor. The snow was too deep. He looked at Peter. I am not saying this to frighten you. I am saying it so you know. The things that happen here are not gentle. They do not wait for you to be ready. He walked away. Peter went inside. Elias was asleep, breathing shallow and fast. Marit was sitting beside him, one hand on his forehead. The neighbor brought poultices, Peter said. I heard. She did not look up. His wife is kind. He said he would bring wood tomorrow. Half a cord. That is generous. Peter sat down on the floor. The fire crackled in the stove. The room was warm, but the warmth felt fragile, like something that could be taken away at any moment. He said his daughter died in '82, a fever in winter. Marit's hand stilled on Elias's forehead. Why did he tell you that? I think he wanted me to understand what this place can do. I already understand. I know. They sat in silence. The fire burned. Outside, the wind rose and fell. Elias coughed in his sleep, and Marit pulled the blanket higher around his shoulders. The fever broke on the 5th day. Elias woke in the morning with clear eyes and asked for food. Real food, not broth. Marit laughed for the first time in a week and made him porridge with the last of the salt pork fat. Peter went outside to find the world transformed. Snow had fallen in the night. Not deep, maybe 3 inches, but enough to cover the brown grass with white. The air was still and cold, the kind of cold that settled into the lungs and stayed there. The stovepipe rose from the white-capped roof like a chimney from a house that had been half swallowed by the earth, which, Peter realized, was exactly what it was. He walked around the house and examined the banking. The sod had held through the snowfall. No gaps had opened. The layer of snow on top of the banking actually helped, adding another inch of insulation between the cold air and the boards beneath. He checked the vent that Kroll had helped him install. Air was flowing in, but slowly, steadily. The fire would draw correctly. He checked the roof. The willow brush layer had done its job. No dirt had sifted through. The sod was intact. For the first time since he had begun digging, Peter allowed himself to feel something other than fear. Not hope, not quite, but something close to it. Something that felt like the ground settling under his feet instead of shifting. Ezra Bell came by 2 days after the first snow. He did not dismount this time. He sat on his mare at the edge of the claim and looked at the house from a distance. The snow had melted in patches, revealing the dark line of the banking against the white prairie. The stovepipe wisped smoke. The door, real boards now hinged and latched, stood closed against the cold. Still standing, Bell said. Peter walked out to meet him. Still standing. The boy? Recovered. The fever broke. Bell nodded. His face was unreadable. The test is not a fever. The test is not 3 inches of snow. The test is what comes in January, what comes in February. The cold that does not lift for weeks. He shifted in the saddle. You have survived a cough and a dusting. Do not mistake that for proof. I do not. Good. Bell turned the mare. Because the real cold is coming. I can feel it in my bones. And when it comes, that house of yours will either hold or it will not. There is no middle ground out here. He rode away. Peter watched him go. The wind picked up, blowing snow in low streamers across the prairie. The sky to the north was dark. Bell was right. This was not the test. This was practice. The real test was coming. By mid-December, the house was as finished as Peter could make it. The banking was complete on all four sides, rising from the ground to within 6 inches of the roof line. The roof was layered, poles, willow brush, sod, and a final layer of prairie grass that Peter had cut and laid over the top to shed water. The door was solid, with a frame of boards and a cover of stitched hides stuffed with dried grass for insulation. The floor was packed earth, smooth and dry, with a slight slope toward a drainage groove that ran along one wall and out through a small gap beneath the banking. The vent worked. The stove drew. The room stayed warm with a small fire and warmer with a larger one. Peter conducted tests. He placed a bucket of water near the upper wall on the coldest night so far, 8 degrees below zero, according to the thermometer Jonas Mercer had lent him. By morning, the water had a skin of ice on top. He placed another bucket near the lower wall, against the earth. By morning, that water was still liquid, cold, but liquid. He let the fire burn down to coals and measured how long the room stayed warm enough to breathe without seeing his breath. 4 hours. With the fire burning low but steady, he could stretch a night's worth of wood into almost nothing. He counted his fuel supply. 3 cords now, with the half cord Mercer had brought. At the rate he was burning, he might make it to March. Might. But might was not a word that kept children alive. Christmas passed without ceremony. Marit cooked a meal from their dwindling stores, beans, salt pork, the last of the flour made into flat bread. Elias sang a song he had learned from his father, who had died the year before in Iowa of a lung infection that no doctor could cure. Peter listened to the boy's voice and watched the firelight move on the earth walls and thought about the home he had left in Norway, the family he would never see again, the life that had led him to this sunken room on a frozen prairie. He did not pray. He had stopped praying years ago. But he felt something that night that was close to gratitude, and he let it stay without examining it too closely. January came. The first week was cold but calm. The temperature dropped to 15 below, then recovered to 5 above, then dropped again. The pattern was familiar now, cold, less cold, cold again. Peter learned to read the sky, the wind, the behavior of the smoke rising from the stovepipe. When the smoke rose straight, the weather would hold. When it bent hard to the south, something was coming. On January 11th, the smoke bent so hard it nearly touched the roof. Peter looked north. The sky was a wall of gray, featureless and heavy, moving toward them faster than clouds should move. He went inside. "Something is coming," he told Marit. "A storm? I do not know, but the sky looks wrong." He spent the rest of the day preparing. He hauled extra wood inside and stacked it against the wall. He filled every container they had with water from the creek a quarter mile south, making trip after trip until his arms ached and his lungs burned from the cold air. He reinforced the door hinges with rope. He stuffed dried grass into every gap he could find around the frame. That night, the temperature began to fall. It had been 12 degrees above zero at sunset. By midnight, it was 0. By dawn, it was 10 below. And then the sun rose, and the air began to warm. January 12th started with a lie. The morning was mild, 40 degrees by mid-morning. The snow began to soften. Water dripped from the eaves of the sod roof. Elias begged to go outside, and Marit let him play near the house while she hung blankets to air in the unexpected warmth. Peter felt uneasy. He could not explain it. The day was pleasant, the mildest day in weeks. But something in the quality of the light, something in the way the wind had dropped to nothing, made him feel like he was standing on ice that had not yet cracked but would. At noon, he looked northwest. The horizon was changing. It was not a cloud. It was not a wall. It was a line, dark and rolling, like the edge of a wave made of smoke and dirt and something worse. It stretched from one end of the visible world to the other, and it was moving toward them faster than a horse could run. Marit, he said. She looked up from the blankets. Get inside, now. She saw his face. She did not argue. Elias, she shouted. The boy was near the lean-to, the small shelter Peter had built for the 2 goats they had managed to acquire. He looked up at his mother's voice. Come inside, now. Elias started toward the house. The wind hit before he reached the door. One moment the air was still. The next, it was a weapon. The wind came from the northwest at a speed Peter had never felt. It knocked him sideways. He grabbed the door frame and held on as the world turned white. Not white from snow falling, white from snow flying. The wind was picking up every loose flake on the ground and hurling it sideways so fast it stung like sand. In the span of a breath, Peter could not see 10 feet in front of him. Elias! Marit screamed. Peter squinted into the white. The boy had been 30 feet away, maybe 40. He should be visible. He should be close enough to see. He saw nothing. Stay here, Peter shouted. He grabbed the rope he had coiled by the door, the rope he had used to haul water, to tie down supplies, to anchor the canvas before they had a real door, and tied one end to the door frame. He paid the rope out as he stepped into the white. The cold hit him like a fist. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in the time it took Marit to shout the boy's name. It was still dropping. He could feel it falling through the air like something solid, like something with weight and intention. Elias! His voice disappeared into the wind. The white swallowed everything. He could not see the lean-to. He could not see the ground beneath his feet. He moved forward, one hand on the rope, the other stretched in front of him, feeling for anything solid. 10 feet, 20 feet. The rope ran through his hand. 30 feet. His hand touched something warm. Elias. The boy was on his knees in the snow, crying, his face red and his hands bare. Peter grabbed him and lifted him and turned back toward where the house should be. He could not see it. He could not see anything. He followed the rope. The door was still there. Marit was still holding it open, a rectangle of firelight in the white chaos. Peter pushed Elias through and stumbled in after him. Marit slammed the door and dropped the bar. Inside, the world was different. The roar of the wind was muffled by the earth walls. The firelight was steady. The temperature was cold, but not killing cold. Peter leaned against the door and breathed. Is he hurt? Marit was already examining Elias, checking his hands, his face, his feet. I do not think so. His hands were bare. His mittens. He took them off to play. I should have. Later. Check him now. Marit wrapped the boy's hands in cloths soaked in warm water. Elias was still crying, but the crying was from fear, not pain. His fingers moved. His toes moved. He had not been out long enough to freeze anything. Peter stood at the door and listened. The wind screamed. It was a sound like nothing he had heard before. Not a howl, not a moan, but a continuous roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The door shuddered in its frame. The walls creaked. Somewhere above, snow was piling against the roof. He looked at the stove. The fire was burning, but the draw was weakened. Smoke was beginning to pool near the ceiling, the vent. He had closed it against the cold before the storm hit. Now the wind was stealing the air the fire needed. He crossed to the south wall and opened the vent. Cold air rushed in, cold enough to bite, but the smoke began to move. The fire brightened. The draw returned. He adjusted the vent until the balance was right, enough air to feed the fire, not so much that the room lost its heat. What do we do? Marit asked. We wait. For how long? Peter looked at the walls, the roof, the packed earth floor that was still dry, still solid. He looked at the fire, the stack of wood, the supplies they had gathered. For as long as it takes. The storm lasted 18 hours. Peter measured it by the fire. Each log burned roughly 2 hours. He burned 9 logs before the wind began to ease. During those 18 hours, the temperature outside dropped to 36 degrees below zero. The wind stayed constant, not gusting, just constant, at a speed that drove snow into drifts 12 feet high in places. The world outside the door became a wall of white, and then a wall of packed snow, and then something they could not see at all because the snow buried the upper half of the door. Inside the sunken house, the temperature stayed above freezing. Not warm, not comfortable, but above freezing. Peter sat awake through the night, feeding the fire, adjusting the vent, listening to the roar above him. Marit slept with Elias curled against her on the pallet nearest the stove. The boy's hands were wrapped in cloth, and he whimpered sometimes in his sleep, but he did not wake. At some point in the middle of the night, someone pounded on the door. Peter jumped up. The pounding came again, not the wind, not debris, but something deliberate, a fist. He unbarred the door and pushed. It moved 6 inches before hitting the snow packed against it. Through the gap, he saw a face. Jonas Mercer. His skin was gray. His eyes were wide with something that might have been fear, or might have been the cold driving all the blood from his face. He was shouting, but Peter could not hear the words over the wind. Peter grabbed his arm and pulled. Mercer fell through the gap, bringing a cascade of snow with him. Peter slammed the door closed and dropped the bar. Mercer lay on the floor, shaking. His coat was crusted with ice. His hands were wrapped in rags that had frozen solid. "My house," Mercer said. His voice was barely audible. "The door latch. It broke. The door blew open. I could not," he coughed, a deep rattling sound. "I could not close it. The fire went out. My wife, my sons." "Are they alive?" "They were in the cellar. I told them to go to the cellar. It is dug into the rise behind the house. But I could not." He coughed again. "I could not find it. The snow, the wind. I could not see. I walked until I saw your smoke, just the smoke. I followed the smoke." Peter looked at the stovepipe rising through the roof. The smoke. In the white chaos of the storm, the smoke from his stove had been the only marker Mercer could find. "Stay here. Get warm." He turned to Marit. "Watch him. Keep the fire burning." "Where are you going?" "Nowhere. I'm going to dig out the door so we can close it properly. And then I'm going to wait for the storm to pass. And then—" He looked at Mercer, shaking on the floor, his hands too frozen to unwrap. "Then we will find his family. If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because the next hours decide whether this house was genius or a grave." The storm ended just after dawn. Peter knew it was ending because the roar changed pitch. The constant scream of the wind began to falter, rising and falling instead of holding steady. The door stopped shuddering. The snow stopped pressing against the roof. He opened the vent wider and let the fresh air flood in. It was cold, cold enough to sting, but it was air, and it was still. And after 18 hours of the storm's violence, the stillness felt like mercy. Mercer was sitting up now, his hands wrapped in warm cloths, his color returning. He had not slept. He had stared at the fire all night, thinking about his wife and sons in the cellar behind his ruined house. "I need to go," he said. "We will go together, as soon as we can see." Peter dug out the door. The snow had drifted against it in a slope that rose nearly to the roof line, but the slope was loose, not packed, and it fell away in chunks as he pushed. When he finally forced the door open far enough to step through, he found himself standing in a world he did not recognize. The prairie was gone. In its place was a white expanse broken only by the dark lines of fence posts and the distant shapes of buildings that had somehow survived. The snow was not deep, maybe 2 feet where it had fallen flat, but the drifts were monstrous. The wind had piled them against every vertical surface, creating walls and ridges that turned the familiar landscape into something alien. Pater's house was barely visible. The banking had caught snow until only the upper foot of wall showed above the white. The stovepipe rose from a mound that looked like a burial site. The door opened into a trench that Pater had dug without realizing he was digging a trench. "Come," he said to Mercer. "Show me where your house is." They walked east. The snow was crusted hard enough to support their weight in places, soft enough to swallow them to the waist in others. Mercer led, his memory of the land compensating for the loss of every landmark. After 20 minutes, they found it. Mercer's house was still standing, but the door hung open, torn from one hinge, and the inside was filled with snow that had drifted in during the 18 hours of wind. The stove was cold. The fire had died within the first hour. Everything that could freeze had frozen. "The cellar," Mercer said. They circled behind the house. The cellar door was buried under a drift. Pater dug while Mercer called out, and after 5 minutes of digging, they heard a response. Muffled. Faint, but alive. Mercer's wife and sons had survived. The cellar was small, barely 10 feet square, but it was dug into the earth like Pater's house was dug into the earth. The ground had kept them alive. They had huddled together through the night with no fire, no light, nothing but each other and the blankets they had grabbed when the door blew open. Mercer's wife was weeping when they pulled her out. His sons, 16 and 14, were silent, their faces blank with the shock of what they had endured. "Your house," Mercer's wife said, looking at the ruined door, the snow-filled rooms. "It is destroyed." "The house can be fixed." Mercer's voice was rough. "You are alive. The boys are alive. The house can be fixed." They walked back to Pater's claim together, the whole family. They could not stay in the ruined house, and there was nowhere else to go. When they reached the sunken house, Mercer's wife stopped. She looked at the mound of snow with the stovepipe rising from it. She looked at the door in its trench, the banking that had nearly disappeared under the drifts. She looked at Pater. "This is where you live?" "Yes, it is." She stopped. She did not know what word to use. "It is warm," Pater said. "Go inside." She went inside. Her sons followed. Marit was there, and Elias, and the fire was burning, and the room was warm enough that they could feel their faces again, warm enough that the shaking stopped, warm enough that Mercer's wife sat down on the floor and began to weep in a different way than she had wept outside. Mercer stood in the doorway. "I told you," he said to Pater. "I told you it would sweat. I told you it would rot. You did. I was wrong." He looked at the earth walls, the low ceiling, the fire burning steady in the stove. "I was wrong about all of it." Pater said nothing. There was nothing to say. The house had held. The house had held when Mercer's house had not. That was all the answer either of them needed. The aftermath revealed the cost. Over the following days, as the snow settled and the temperature slowly climbed back toward zero, Pater learned what the storm had done. A family 3 miles north had lost their youngest child, a boy of 4 who had wandered outside during the first minutes of the storm when the air was still warm and the danger was not yet visible. They found his body 100 yards from the house, frozen in the snow. 2 men from the settlement near Broken Bow had died trying to reach their livestock. The wind had disoriented them, and they had walked in circles until the cold took them. A woman on a claim south of Pedders had survived alone by stuffing herself into a hay pile in her barn and staying there for 12 hours. She lost 3 fingers to frostbite. Everywhere Peter heard the same story. The storm had come too fast, too hard, too cold. The mild morning had fooled everyone. People had been outside, working, playing, traveling between buildings. And then the wall of wind had hit, and the world had vanished, and those who could not find shelter in minutes had died in hours. Peter's house had held, not because it was perfectly built, not because he had made no mistakes, but because the earth walls did not leak heat the way board walls leaked it, because the low roof did not catch wind the way tall roofs caught it, because the temperature inside had stayed above freezing through 18 hours of cold that killed everyone who could not find similar shelter. He had burned 9 logs. In a normal house, he would have burned 20, maybe more. The math had worked. The impossible had become possible. On the 3rd day after the storm, Ezra Bell came. He did not ride this time. He walked, picking his way through the drifts, his breath steaming in the cold air. When he reached the sunken house, he stopped and looked at it for a long moment. Then he knocked on the door. Peter opened it. "You lived," Bell said. "We lived." "I know. I heard." Bell's voice was flat, but his eyes were not. "I heard that Jonas Mercer's family spent the night here, that his house failed and yours did not." "That is true." "I heard that you burned less than half the wood a normal house would have burned, that the temperature inside stayed above freezing through the whole storm." "That is also true." Bell stood in the doorway. He did not ask to come in. He did not need to. "I have been on this prairie for 20 years, he said. "I have seen men build every kind of shelter you can imagine. Board houses, sod houses, dugouts, half dugouts, lean-tos, barns converted to living quarters. I've seen good builders and bad builders. I've seen men who knew what they were doing and men who did not." He paused. "I have never seen anyone do what you did. Dig a pit in flat ground and make it hold heat through a storm that killed people in proper houses." He looked at Peter. "I told you that you would freeze them from the floor up. I was wrong." It was not an apology. Bell did not apologize, but it was an acknowledgement, and from Ezra Bell, that was more than most men ever received. "The floor is the warmest part," Peter said. "The earth holds the heat. The floor is where we put the children." Bell nodded slowly. "Show me," he said. "Show me how it works." Peter stepped aside and let him in. The week after the storm, Peter's claim became a destination. Men came from miles away to see the house that it held. They stood at the edge of the excavation and looked down at the low walls, the banked sod, the stovepipe rising from the roof like a finger pointing at the sky. They asked questions. How deep was the pit? How thick were the earth walls? How much wood had he burned through the worst of it? Peter answered them all. He had nothing to hide and no reason to guard the knowledge. The method was simple. The materials were free. Anyone with a spade and time could do what he had done, but not everyone believed it could be replicated, and not everyone wanted to try. Jonas Mercer was the first to commit. He came to Peter's claim 3 days after his family had returned to their damaged house. The door had been rehung, the snow cleared out, the stove relit. But the memory of that night, the door breaking, the fire dying, his wife and sons huddling in the dark cellar, had changed something in him. "I want to add a room," he said. "Dug into the ground, connected to the house but below grade. Something that will hold heat when the upper house fails. It will not fail if you fix it properly. It failed once. It can fail again." Mercer's jaw was tight. "I will not gamble with my family a second time." Peter walked with him to Mercer's claim. They studied the land behind the house, looking for the best place to dig. The ground sloped gently toward the south, which meant water would naturally drain away from an excavation cut into the north face. Here, Pater said. You dig here, 8 feet by 10. 3 feet deep is enough if you bank it heavily. Connect it to your cellar with a passage. When the upper house holds, you use it for storage. When the upper house fails, you use it for shelter. Will you help me dig? Yes. They began the next day. The work brought questions that Pater had not anticipated. Mercer wanted to know everything, not just the dimensions, but the reasoning. Why 4 feet deep for a full house, and only 3 for a connected room? Why angle the walls outward near the top? Why put the drainage trench upslope instead of down? Pater explained as they worked. The deeper the dig, the more stable the temperature, but also the more labor and the greater the risk of water seeping in. The angled walls gave the earth a shelf to rest on, preventing slump. The drainage trench caught water before it reached the excavation, not after. How did you learn all this? Mercer asked. August Kroll taught me, the well digger. Kroll, Mercer nodded. I've heard of him. He dug the Hendricks well, the one that never went dry. People say he can read the ground like a book. He can. He looked at my pit and told me 3 things I was doing wrong. I would have failed without him. Where is he now? I do not know. He said he would come by before the deep cold, but the storm came before he did. Mercer was quiet for a moment, driving his spade into the frozen ground. Do you think he survived? Pater had been trying not to think about that. Kroll had been working claims across the county, digging wells and cellars for anyone who would pay. He could have been anywhere when the storm hit. He could have been caught in the open, like the men who died trying to reach their livestock. He could have been in a shelter that failed, like Mercer's house. I do not know, Pater said. The answer came 4 days later. A man rode onto Pater's claim at dusk. Pater did not recognize him. He was young, maybe 25, with a face reddened by cold and eyes that looked like they had not slept in days. Are you the Norwegian? The man asked. The one who built the sunken house? I am. Kroll sent me. August Kroll. Pater felt something loosen in his chest. He is alive? He is alive, but he is hurt. The man dismounted. His leg. He was caught in a collapse during the storm. A cellar he was digging for a widow on the Schuyler Road. The walls came in when the ground froze too fast. He got out, but his leg is broken. He cannot travel. Where is he? At the widow's house, 12 miles northwest. He asked me to find you. He said you would want to know. Pater looked at the house, at Marit in the doorway, at Elias playing near the woodpile. I will go tomorrow, he said. The ride took most of the morning. The snow had settled and crusted, making travel easier but not easy. Pater followed the directions the young man had given him, navigating by landmarks that were half buried and half transformed by the drifts. The widow's house was a sod structure, small and low, built into the side of a gentle rise. Smoke rose from the chimney. Pater tied his borrowed horse to the fence post and knocked on the door. A woman answered. She was older than Pater had expected, maybe 60, with gray hair pulled back and hands that looked like they had worked every day of her life. You are the Norwegian, she said. It was not a question. Yes, I am here for August Kroll. He is inside. He has been asking for you. She stepped aside to let him enter. The interior was dim, lit by a single window and the glow from a small stove. Kroll was lying on a pallet near the fire, his left leg splinted with boards and wrapped in cloth. His face was pale, but his eyes were sharp. You came, Kroll said. I came. Sit. There is nothing you can do for the leg. The bone is set. It will heal or it will not. He gestured to a stool near the pallet. But there are things I need to tell you. Things I should have told you before. Pater sat. The storm, Kroll said. How did your house hold? It held. The temperature stayed above freezing. We burned less than half the wood we would have burned in a house above ground. Good. Good. Kroll's eyes closed for a moment. I knew it would work. I knew from the first time I saw your cut lines. You were building with the earth, not against it. You taught me how. I showed you a few things. The rest you figured out yourself. Kroll opened his eyes. That is the difference between a man who learns and a man who copies. A copier does exactly what he is told and fails when conditions change. A learner understands why he is doing what he is doing and adapts when he has to. I made mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. The question is whether you survive them long enough to learn from them. He shifted on the pallet, wincing as the movement jarred his leg. I have been digging in this ground for 22 years. Wells, cellars, foundations. I have seen the earth do things that no book could predict. Shift when it should stay still. Hold when it should collapse. The ground has rules, but the rules are not simple. They change from place to place, season to season, storm to storm. How do you learn them? You watch, you listen. You put your hand on the earth and feel what it is telling you. Kroll's voice was quieter now. When I was young, I thought the earth was an enemy, something to be conquered, forced into the shape I wanted. I broke my back trying to make it obey. And then I got older, and I realized the earth was not an enemy. It was a partner, a difficult partner, stubborn and unpredictable, but a partner. When I started working with it instead of against it, everything became easier. He looked at Pater. That is what you did. You did not fight the prairie. You let it help you. The earth wall became your wall. The earth temperature became your temperature. You stopped trying to build a house that could defeat the winter and started building a house that could survive it. I did not know any other way. That is why it worked. A man with more resources would have built a bigger house, a taller house, a house with more wood and more fuel. And that house would have burned through everything it had in the first 8 hours of the storm, and the man inside would have frozen. Kroll reached out and gripped Pater's arm. His hand was weaker than it had been, but the grip was still firm. Promise me something. What? Teach others. What you know, what you learned, do not keep it to yourself. There are families on this prairie who will die in the next storm because they built the way everyone told them to build. They will die because no one showed them another way. His eyes held Pater's. Show them. I will. Good. Kroll released his arm. Now go. There is nothing more I can do for you. The rest you will have to learn yourself. Pater stayed for an hour, talking with Kroll about drainage and wall angles and the behavior of frozen ground. Then he rode back to his claim, arriving after dark. Marit was waiting at the door. How is he? His leg is broken. He may not walk properly again. Will he live? I do not know. He's old. The break was bad. Pater looked at the house, at the earth walls and the low roof and the stovepipe breathing smoke into the night. He asked me to teach others what I know, what he taught me. Will you? Yes. The weeks after the storm brought a slow thaw, not in the weather, which remained bitter, but in the community's attitude toward Pater's house. Men who had laughed at the sunken structure now came with questions. Women who had whispered about the Norwegian keeping his sister underground now asked Marit how the room stayed warm. Children who had called it a grave now called it something else, something without a name, just a description. the house that held. Ezra Bell came back twice more. The first time, he brought a nephew from Iowa who was thinking of filing a claim. The second time, he brought two men from the settlement near Broken Bow who had lost neighbors in the storm and wanted to know what could be done differently. Pater showed them all. He walked them around the excavation, explained the banking, demonstrated the vent, described the way the earth temperature stayed steady while the air temperature swung wildly. He drew diagrams in the dirt with a stick. He answered every question. "Why do you give this away?" Bell asked after the second visit. "You could charge for it. Men would pay. Kroll gave it to me. I am giving it to them. Kroll charged for his work. Kroll charged for his labor. He never charged for his knowledge." Pater looked at the men who were examining the roof, running their hands over the sod banking. Knowledge that is hoarded dies with the man who hoards it. Knowledge that is shared grows stronger. Bell was quiet for a moment. "You sound like a preacher." "I sound like a man who almost died and did not. That changes what you value." The practical skeptic's conversion came in February. Jonas Mercer had finished his connected room, the underground extension to his house that would serve as shelter if the upper structure failed again. He invited Pater to inspect it before he sealed the connection passage. The room was well built. Not perfect, the walls were slightly uneven, the drainage trench a foot shorter than it should have been, but solid, functional, safe. "You did this yourself," Pater said. "My sons helped. But the design is yours. The knowledge is yours." Mercer stood in the low-ceilinged room, his head nearly brushing the sod roof. "I told you this would sweat and rot. I told you that you were digging your own grave." "You did." "I was wrong." Mercer's voice was flat, factual. "The walls do not sweat. The earth is dry. The temperature is steady." He looked at Pater. "I have lived on this prairie for 3 years. I have seen storms that killed livestock, storms that buried houses, storms that turned the world white for days. I have never seen a shelter that could hold warmth through all of it without burning through every stick of wood in the county. The earth does the work, not the fire." "I understand that now." Mercer extended his hand. "I was wrong, and I am grateful that you were right." They shook hands. "Your wife," Pater said, "is she reconciled to living partly underground?" Mercer almost smiled. "She says it is the warmest room in the house. She wants to move the beds down here permanently." But not everyone was grateful. Silas Rourke came to Pater's claim on a gray afternoon in late February. He rode the same gray horse, wore the same town coat, carried the same expression of calculation barely disguised as friendliness. "I hear you have been busy," Rourke said, not dismounting. Pater was splitting wood near the house. He set down the axe. "Busy enough." "Teaching people how to build houses that do not need lumber, showing them how to dig holes in the ground and call them homes." Rourke's voice was light, but his eyes were not. "That's bad for my business." "Your business is selling things people need. If they need less, that is not my concern." "It should be your concern. A man who undermines the economy of a settlement is not popular. People remember who helped them and who hurt them." "I helped them survive a storm that killed their neighbors. I think they will remember that." Rourke shifted in the saddle. "The storm was unusual. A freak event. It will not happen again for years. And when it does, the people who built proper houses will be fine. The people who dug holes in the ground will discover that holes flood, holes collapse, holes breed disease." Rourke leaned forward. "I have been in this country longer than you, Norwegian. I have seen every kind of shelter that desperate men build, and I have seen them fail. All of them. Sooner or later, they fail. Mine did not fail. Not yet. Rourke pulled the reins. But there is always another storm, always another test. And when your house fails, when the ground shifts or the water rises or the roof collapses, I will be there, with lumber, with coal, with credit terms that will seem very generous compared to freezing to death. He rode away. Pater picked up the axe and went back to splitting wood. His hands were steady, but something cold had settled in his chest that had nothing to do with the weather. Rourke was not threatening him with violence. He was threatening him with time, with the slow accumulation of doubt that could turn a community's gratitude into suspicion, with the whisper campaigns that could make a hero into a fool. The battle was not over. It had only moved to different ground. Word came in March that August Kroll had died. The young man who had brought the news of Kroll's injury returned with the news of his death. Infection, he said. The break had not healed cleanly, and something had gone wrong inside the leg. Kroll had lasted 2 weeks after the fever set in, then slipped away in his sleep. Peter received the news standing in the doorway of his sunken house. The spring thaw had begun, and water was running in the drainage trench, carrying snowmelt away from the excavation exactly as Kroll had shown him. Did he say anything? Peter asked. At the end? He said to tell the Norwegian that the ground remembers. That is all? That is all. The young man left. Peter stood in the doorway and watched him ride away. The ground remembers. He did not fully understand what Kroll had meant, but he thought he understood part of it. The earth held traces of everything that had been done to it, every cut, every excavation, every wall that had been built, and every wall that had collapsed. A man who knew how to read those traces could learn from the mistakes and successes of everyone who had come before. Kroll had spent 22 years learning to read the ground. He had passed some of that knowledge to Peter. Now he was gone, and the knowledge that remained was whatever Peter could remember and apply. It was not enough. It would never be enough. But it was what he had. That night, after Marit and Elias were asleep, Peter sat by the stove and thought about the man who had taught him. Kroll had appeared at the edge of the excavation on a gray October afternoon, looked at the pit, and said, "You are wrong in 3 places." He had not introduced himself first. He had not asked permission. He had simply stated the truth and waited to see what Peter would do with it. That was the kind of teacher Kroll had been, not gentle, not patient, just accurate. He told you what was wrong, showed you how to fix it, and left you to decide whether the fixing was worth the effort. Peter had decided it was, and because of that decision, his family was alive, his house was standing, and his neighbors were learning to build shelters that could survive the worst this prairie could offer. The fire burned low. The room stayed warm. Outside, the spring wind moved across the snow, and somewhere beneath the frozen surface, the earth was remembering everything that had been done to it, holding the record of every success and every failure, waiting for the next person who knew how to listen. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The secondary crisis came in late March. A woman named Clara Dahl arrived at Peter's claim on foot, her face raw from cold and exertion. She had walked 3 miles from her homestead, and she was asking for help. "My husband is dead," she said. 3 weeks ago. The fever took him. I have 2 children. The house is—" She stopped, her breath catching. "The house is failing." "Failing how?" "The wall. The north wall. It is bowing inward. The snow load pushed it, and now it is cracking. I have propped it with timbers, but every day the crack grows wider." Peter looked at Marit. She nodded. "Show me," he said. The Dahl homestead was a board house, built tall and straight in the conventional style. It had survived the January storm, but the survival had cost it. The north wall had taken the brunt of the wind and snow, and the pressure had warped the frame. A crack ran from the roof line to within 2 feet of the foundation. Pater examined it carefully. The interior props were holding, but they were temporary. The wall would fail completely within weeks, maybe days. "Can you fix it?" Clara asked. "I can try to reinforce it, but the frame is damaged. Even if I brace the wall, it will never be as strong as it was." "What else can I do?" Pater looked at the land around the house. It was flat, exposed, no different from his own claim. But behind the house there was a slight depression where water pooled in the spring rains. "You could build a shelter," he said. "A connected room, like Mercer built, dug into the ground, banked with sod. If the wall fails completely, you would have somewhere to go." "I cannot dig. I have 2 children and no help." "I will help you." He began the next day. The ground was still frozen in places, thawed in others. Petter worked around the frozen sections, cutting into the softer earth first, expanding the excavation as the thaw progressed. Clara's children, a girl of 8 and a boy of 5, watched from the doorway of the failing house. Jonas Mercer came on the second day. He had heard about the widow's trouble from someone in town. "I thought you might need another back," he said. They worked together. Mercer asked fewer questions now. He understood the method. His hands knew what to do without being told. On the third day, Ezra Bell arrived. "I heard the doll place is in trouble," he said. He did not offer to help. He stood at the edge of the excavation and watched. "The wall is failing," Pater said. "We are building her a shelter." A shelter. Bell looked at the hole in the ground, the earth walls taking shape, the sod piled nearby. "Like yours." "Yes." "And who taught you this? The well digger?" "Kroll." "Yes." "Kroll is dead, I heard." "He is dead." Bell was quiet for a long moment. "Then you are the one who carries it now. The knowledge." He looked at Pater. "You understand what that means?" "I am beginning to." "It means people will come to you when their houses fail, when the weather turns, when they do not know what else to do. They will come to you, and you will have to decide whether to help them." "I have already decided." "Have you?" Bell's eyes were sharp. "Helping one widow is easy. Helping everyone who asks is different. There will be more storms, more failures, more people who built the way they were told to build and discovered it was not enough. Will you help all of them?" Pater drove his spade into the earth. "I will help as many as I can." The shelter was finished in 6 days. It was smaller than Pater's house, 8 feet by 10, 3 feet deep, but it was solid. The walls were cut clean and angled properly. The drainage trench ran downslope to the depression behind the main house. The roof was poles and willow brush and sod, sealed tight against the weather. Clara Dahl stood in the low room, her children beside her. "It is dark," the girl said. "It will keep you warm," Pater said. "When the other wall fails, when the weather turns bad, this room will hold." "How do you know?" "Because I built one like it, and it held through the worst storm this prairie has seen in years." Clara looked at him. "Why did you help me? You do not know me. I have nothing to pay you." "Kroll helped me. He asked only that I help others. I am keeping that promise." "The well digger?" "Yes." "People said he was strange, that he talked to the ground." "He listened to it. There is a difference." Clara almost smiled. It was the first time Pater had seen her expression change since she arrived at his claim. "Thank you," she said, "for listening." Word of the doll shelter spread. People talked about the Norwegian who had dug a room for a widow without asking for payment. They talked about the way the shelter looked, low and strange, more like a root cellar than a house. They talked about the fact that it had been built in 6 days by 2 men, and that it would survive weather that would destroy a board house 3 times its size. Some people admired it, some people mocked it. Some people wondered whether they should build something similar on their own claims. And some people, a small number but growing, began to ask Peter to help them. He could not help them all. The spring was coming, and there was work to do on his own claim. Crops to plant, fences to repair, a roof to reseal after the winter. But he helped when he could. He walked claims with men who wanted to know where to dig. He explained the principles to women who wanted to understand how earth could replace wood. He drew diagrams and answered questions and repeated the same lessons over and over until they began to take root. The knowledge was spreading, slowly, unevenly, but spreading. Silas Rourke noticed. He came to Peter's claim in April, when the ground had finally thawed and the first green shoots were pushing through the brown grass. This time, he dismounted. This time, his expression was not calculated friendliness, but something closer to anger. "You're costing me money," he said. Peter was repairing the door frame. He set down his tools but did not step away from the work. "I am teaching people how to survive." "You are teaching people that they do not need what I sell. Lumber, coal, hardware." Rourke's voice was tight. 3 families have canceled orders this month. 3. They say they are building the Norwegian way. They say they do not need as much material. They say the earth will do the work. The earth does do the work. That is not a lie. It is not the whole truth either. Rourke stepped closer. What happens when the ground shifts, when the water rises, when a child gets sick from living in a damp hole? You will not be there to answer for it. You will be on your own claim, warm and dry, while the families who listen to you suffer the consequences. The families who listen to me survived the January storm. The families who listened to you burned through all their fuel and froze. Rourke's face went dark. One storm, one winter. You think that proves something? I think it proves that your way is not the only way, and I think that frightens you. For a moment, Peter thought Rourke might strike him. The man's hands were clenched, his jaw tight, his eyes blazing with something that looked like hatred. But Rourke did not strike. He stepped back, his face smoothing into something that was not calm, but was controlled. "This is not over," he said. "One bad winter, one failed shelter, one child who dies of damp and cold, that is all it will take. And when that happens, everyone will remember that the Norwegian told them to dig holes instead of building proper houses." He mounted his horse. "I will be watching and I will be waiting." He rode away. Peter watched him go. The confrontation had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. Rourke was right about one thing. The method was not perfect. There were risks. There were failure modes. A shelter built badly could flood, could collapse, could breed the kind of sickness that killed more people than cold ever did. But the same was true of every shelter. Board houses burned, sod houses leaked, dugouts flooded. There was no perfect solution, no method that eliminated all risk. There was only the choice between risks, the risk of building with the earth versus the risk of building against it. Peter had made his choice. He would live with the consequences. By May, 3 more families had built connected shelters on their claims. 1 was a full-depth room like Peter's. 2 were shallower, 3-foot digs like the one he had built for Clara Dahl. Peter visited each one before winter returned. He checked the drainage, the banking, the wall angles. He pointed out problems and showed the families how to fix them. He answered questions and gave advice and tried to pass on everything Kroll had taught him. It was not enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. And when the first cold winds of autumn began to blow across the prairie, Peter looked at the houses dotting the land, some tall and conventional, some low and strange, and felt something he had not felt since arriving on the claim. Not hope exactly. Something quieter, something more like the feeling of ground settling under his feet. The earth remembered. And now, so did the people who lived on it. The second winter came earlier than the first. October brought the first hard freeze, and by November the ground was locked solid. Peter had spent the summer and autumn preparing. The woodpile behind the house held 5 cords now, twice what he had started with the year before. The banking on the walls was thicker, the drainage trench deeper, the roof resealed with fresh sod and a double layer of willow brush. But the preparations that mattered most were not his own. Across the district, families had built shelters. Some were full-depth rooms like Peter's. Some were shallow connected spaces like the one he had dug for Clara Dahl. Some were modifications of existing structures, cellars deepened, walls banked, vents added to improve airflow. The designs varied, but the principle was the same. Let the earth do part of the work. When the cold came, Peter found himself thinking about all of them. The Mercer family in their connected room, Clara Dahl and her children in the shelter behind her failing house, the Hansen brothers who had dug a shared space between their 2 claims, the widow Bjornsson who had banked her sod house so heavily it looked like a burial mound from a distance. Would the shelters hold? Would the drainage trenches keep the water out? Would the vents draw properly when the wind shifted? He would not know until the winter tested them. The test came in late December. It was not as violent as the January storm of the previous year. There was no sudden temperature drop, no wall of wind appearing from the northwest. This storm built slowly, a grinding cold that deepened day by day, dropping from 10 below to 20 below to 30 below over the course of a week. The cold did not kill quickly. It killed slowly, patiently, through the steady drain of heat from every structure that could not hold it. Peter's house held. The temperature inside stayed above freezing with a small fire. The earth walls did their work, buffering the interior from the worst of the cold, keeping the ground warmth trapped inside. On the 4th day of the cold snap, Jonas Mercer came by. "The connected room is working," he said. His breath steamed in the frigid air. "My wife has moved the children down there. It is warmer than the main house. How much wood are you burning?" "Half what we burned last year. Maybe less." Peter nodded. The numbers were what mattered. The numbers were proof. "Have you heard from the others?" "The Hansen brothers sent word yesterday. Their shared shelter is holding. Clara Dahl's children are sleeping in the underground room every night." Mercer paused. "But there is trouble at the Schroeder place." "What kind of trouble?" "Their shelter is flooding, water coming up through the floor. They did not dig the drainage trench deep enough and the ground is pushing moisture into the room." Peter felt his stomach tighten. Can they fix it? In this cold? The ground is frozen. They cannot dig anything. Mercer's face was grim. They are using the shelter for storage now, sleeping in the main house, burning through their wood faster than they planned. How much wood do they have? Maybe 2 weeks' worth, if the cold holds. Peter looked at the sky, gray and heavy, pressing down on the white prairie like a hand. "I will go see them tomorrow." The Schroeder place was 6 miles east, farther than Peter usually traveled in deep cold. He wrapped himself in every layer he owned and rode out at first light, when the temperature was at its coldest, but the day was longest. The Schroeder family had built their shelter the previous summer, following instructions Peter had given them. But instructions were not the same as supervision, and supervision was not the same as experience. They had made mistakes. The shelter was dug into a low spot instead of a high spot. The drainage trench was too short and aimed at flat ground instead of a natural runoff channel. The walls were cut straight instead of angled, which meant the upper sections were already showing signs of slump. Peter examined the flooding. The water was seeping up through the floor, not running in from outside. The ground itself was pushing moisture into the excavation, the way a squeezed sponge pushes water through its pores. "Can you fix it?" Carl Schroeder asked. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and strong, but his voice was thin with worry. "Not now. Not in this cold. The ground is frozen solid. Any digging I do will just create cracks that fill with ice and make the problem worse." "Then what do we do?" Peter thought about it. The shelter was compromised. It would not hold heat properly with water on the floor, but the main house was bleeding heat through every seam, and the woodpile was shrinking faster than it should. "You bank the main house," Peter said. "Pile snow against the walls. Pack it tight. The snow will act like sod, blocking the wind and holding in the heat." "Snow? You want me to bury my house in snow?" "I want you to survive until spring. In spring, we fix the shelter properly. But right now, your house needs help, and snow is what you have." Schroeder stared at him. "You are serious." "I am serious." They spent the rest of the day piling snow against the Schroeder house. Carl's wife brought out hot water to keep them from freezing. The children watched from the window, their faces pale against the frost. By nightfall, the house was banked on 3 sides with packed snow. The 4th side, where the door was, they left clear for access. "It feels different," Carl said, standing inside the house. The fire was burning, and for the first time in days, the flames were not fighting a constant draft. "It feels warmer. The snow blocks the wind. The wind was stealing your heat." Peter pulled on his gloves. "Keep the banking in place until the cold breaks. Then we talk about fixing the shelter." "Thank you." "Do not thank me. Thank the cold for teaching you what I should have taught you better." The Schroeder incident stayed with Peter through the rest of the winter. Rourke had been right about one thing. The method was not foolproof. Mistakes could be made. Shelters could fail. The earth that protected could also betray if you did not understand how to work with it. Peter had taught people the basics: where to dig, how deep, how to bank and drain and vent. But he had not taught them everything. He had not shown them how to read the ground, how to recognize the signs of a bad location, how to adapt when conditions changed. Kroll could have taught them those things. Kroll had spent 22 years learning to listen to the earth, but Kroll was dead, and the knowledge he had carried was only partially transmitted. Peter resolved to do better. The cold broke in late January. The temperature climbed from 30 below to 10 below to 5 above, and the world began to breathe again. Peter spent February visiting every shelter in the district. He walked the sites, examined the construction, identified the problems. Some were minor, a vent too small, a banking slope too shallow. Some were serious, drainage failures, wall slumps, roof sags that threatened collapse. He fixed what he could fix and taught people to fix what he could not. At each site, he asked the same questions. What worked? What failed? What did you learn? The answers varied, but patterns emerged. The shelters that worked best were the ones dug into slightly elevated ground, away from natural drainage paths. The shelters that failed were the ones built in convenient locations that turned out to be convenient for water as well as people. Location mattered more than construction. The site determined the outcome before the first spade broke ground. Kroll had known that. He had chosen the right location for Peter's house without explaining why. Now Peter understood. In March, the hostile skeptic's arc finally broke. The winter had been hard on Silas Rourke's business. The families who had built shelters had burned less wood, needed less coal, required fewer emergency supplies. The families who had built conventional houses had burned through their reserves faster, but even they had learned to bank their structures with snow, reducing the demand for fuel. Rourke had extended credit to several families who could not pay. The debts were mounting, the repayments were not coming, and then the Garrett house burned. The Garretts had not built a shelter. They had built a tall board house, the tallest in the district, with a proper frame and proper walls, and a proper stove. The stove had overheated on a cold night in late February. A spark had caught the wall. The family had escaped, but the house was gone. Rourke had financed the house. The Garretts had been making payments on the lumber, the hardware, the stove itself. Now there was no house, no payments, and a family with nothing but the clothes they wore and the debt they owed. Pater heard about it 3 days after the fire. "The Garretts are staying with Ezra Bell," Jonas Mercer told him. "Bell took them in. They have nothing." "And Rourke?" "Rourke is trying to collect. He says the debt survives the fire. He wants them to sign over their claim to cover what they owe." "Their claim is all they have." "I know." Pater rode to Bell's place that afternoon. The Garretts were a young couple, barely into their 20s, with a baby girl who had not stopped crying since the fire. They sat in Bell's front room, wrapped in borrowed blankets, their faces blank with shock. "Rourke was here this morning," Bell said quietly, pulling Pater aside. "Brought papers for them to sign. I told him to leave." "Will he come back?" "He will come back. The man does not give up." Bell looked at the young couple. "They cannot pay. They have nothing. If they sign over the claim, they lose everything. If they do not sign, Rourke will hound them until they break." "What if someone else paid the debt?" "With what? No one in this district has that kind of money." Pater thought about it. The amount owed was probably more than anyone could spare, but maybe the amount owed was not the point. "What if the community paid?" he said. "Not the full debt, just enough to give them time, a partial payment from everyone who can afford to give something." "A collection?" "A collection, for the Garretts, to keep Rourke from taking their claim." Bell was quiet for a moment. It would embarrass him, publicly, the community coming together to pay off one of his debts. Yes, he would not forget that. No, he would not. Bell almost smiled. Good. The collection took 2 weeks to organize. Pater went to every family in the district, the ones who had built shelters and the ones who had not, the ones who had survived the winter easily and the ones who had barely survived at all. He explained the situation. He asked for whatever they could spare. Most people gave something, $1 here, 50 cents there, a few pounds of flour, or a side of salt pork that could be sold for cash. The amounts were small, but they added up. Jonas Mercer gave $5. Clara Dahl gave $2, money she could not afford, but insisted on contributing. The Hansen brothers gave $3 between them and promised to help rebuild the Garrett house come spring. By the end of the 2 weeks, Pater had collected $47.12. It was not enough to pay the full debt, but it was enough to make a partial payment that would satisfy the terms of the credit agreement and prevent Rourke from seizing the claim. He brought the money to Rourke's office in Broken Bow on a Thursday afternoon. Rourke was behind his desk when Pater entered. His expression did not change when he saw who it was. "The Norwegian," he said. "Come to gloat?" "Come to pay." Pater set the money on the desk, coins and bills and a few promissory notes from people who did not have cash but had goods to trade. $47.12, partial payment on the Garrett debt. Rourke looked at the money. He did not touch it. Where did this come from? The community. People who wanted to help. People you convinced to help. I asked, they gave. I did not convince anyone of anything. Rourke's jaw tightened. This does not clear the debt. It satisfies the partial payment clause. The Garretts have 3 more months to pay the rest. And if they cannot, then they cannot. but you will not take their claim today." Rourke stood slowly. He was taller than Peter, broader in the shoulders. He used his size the way some men used weapons, as a reminder of what could happen if things went badly. "You think you have won something," he said. "You think this makes you a hero, the Norwegian who saved the poor family from the greedy merchant." "I do not think about winning. I think about surviving." "There's no difference." Rourke stepped closer. "In this country, survival is winning. And the people who help the weak survive are the people who understand that the weak can become strong, that they can become customers, that they can become allies." His voice dropped. "I sold lumber because lumber was what people needed. Now you have taught them to need less, so I will sell less. And when I sell less, I will find other things to sell, other ways to make money, other ways to survive." "And the Garretts?" "The Garretts will pay or they will not. If they do not, I will take their claim. Not today, not next month, but eventually." Rourke picked up the money and began counting it. "This changes nothing. It delays. That is all." He finished counting and made a note in a ledger. "The payment is recorded. The Garretts have 3 months." He looked up. "Now get out of my office." Peter left. The Garrett house was rebuilt that spring. 14 men from the district came together over 3 days to raise the frame. The lumber came from a supplier in Ord, not from Rourke's yard. The design was different this time: shorter walls, a lower profile, and a connected shelter dug behind the main structure in case of future emergencies. Peter supervised the shelter construction. He made sure the site was right, the drainage was right, the walls were angled properly. He made sure the mistakes of the Schroeder shelter would not be repeated here. When the house was finished, the Garretts stood in front of it with their baby girl and looked at what the community had built for them. "We do not know how to thank you," Thomas Garrett said. "Live," Peter said. "That is thanks enough." The summer brought someone new to the district. Her name was Anna Lindgren. She was Jonas Mercer's cousin by marriage, a widow from Minnesota who had lost her husband to a logging accident 2 years before. She had no children and no family left in Minnesota. When Mercer wrote to her about the opportunities in Nebraska, she had sold everything and come west. Peter met her at the Mercer place in July. She was not what he had expected. He had imagined someone fragile, broken by loss, looking for protection. Instead, he found a woman with calloused hands and steady eyes who asked sharp questions and did not accept vague answers. "Jonas says you built a house in the ground," she said. "Half in the ground." "Why?" "Because I did not have enough lumber for a full house, and the earth holds heat better than the air." "Does it work?" "It survived a storm that killed people in houses built the regular way." She nodded slowly. "Show me." He showed her. They walked around the excavation, and Peter explained the banking, the drainage, the vent, the relationship between depth and temperature stability. Anna asked questions at every step, not skeptical questions, curious ones. She wanted to understand how the system worked, not whether it worked. "You could teach this," she said when they finished. "I do teach it. Anyone who asks." "No, I mean really teach it. Write it down. Make drawings. Create something that people could follow even if you were not there to explain." Peter had thought about it. He had thought about it ever since Kroll died, ever since he realized that knowledge in one person's head was knowledge that could vanish overnight. "I am not a writer," he said. "Then find someone who is." Anna looked at him. "The things you know are worth preserving. The people who learned from you are alive because of what you taught them, but you cannot teach everyone yourself. You need to find a way to spread this without being there." "Are you volunteering?" "Maybe." She almost smiled. "I can write. I can draw. I cannot dig a proper drainage trench, but I can learn. Anna stayed through the summer. She moved into a small room at the Mercer place and spent her days learning the system that Peter had built. She watched him work on the Garrett shelter. She asked questions about the Schroeder failure. She interviewed families who had survived the winter in their underground rooms and families whose shelters had flooded or slumped. She took notes on everything. By autumn, she had filled 3 notebooks with drawings, specifications, and explanations. The drainage chapter alone was 20 pages, covering soil types, slope calculations, and the signs that indicated a bad site. The banking chapter included diagrams of proper angles and warnings about common mistakes. "This is good," Peter said, flipping through the pages. "It is a start. It needs to be tested. We need to give it to someone who has never built one of these and see if they can follow it." "Who?" "The Petersons. They are new. They arrived last month. They have never seen your house or anyone else's." Peter looked at her. "You have thought about this." "I've thought about nothing else for 3 months." She took the notebooks back. "This knowledge saved lives. It should save more. The only question is whether we can spread it fast enough to matter." The Petersons built their shelter that autumn, working from Anna's notebooks. They made mistakes. The drainage trench was 6 inches too short. The wall angle was slightly wrong on the north side. The vent was positioned where it would catch wind instead of avoiding it. But they caught the mistakes before they became failures. The notebooks included checklists, and the checklists caught the errors. The Petersons corrected the drainage, adjusted the wall, repositioned the vent. By the time the first snow fell, their shelter was sound. Anna revised the notebooks based on what the Petersons had learned. She added warnings where warnings were needed. She clarified instructions that had been unclear. She created a troubleshooting section for problems that might emerge after construction. "This is becoming a real guide," Peter said. "It is becoming a real guide, one that someone could use without ever meeting you." He looked at her. She was sitting at the table in his house. The notebook spread around her, her face lit by the lamp. She had been there every evening for a month, working on the revisions. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "Because it matters." She did not look up. "Because knowledge that dies with one person is knowledge lost. Because the people who come after us deserve to know what we learned." "That is not an answer." She looked up. "It is the only answer I have." Peter married Anna in the spring of 1890. The ceremony was small. Jonas Mercer stood as a witness. Marit and Elias watched from the front row. Ezra Bell came, though he did not stay for the celebration afterward. "You chose well," Bell said as he left. "She has a practical mind." "She has a better mind than mine." "That is why I said you chose well." The years compress the way years do when they are full of work. Anna finished the notebooks in 1891. They were copied by hand, 30 copies distributed to families across the district, and then to families in neighboring districts who had heard about the Norwegian method. Peter taught when he could and delegated when he could not. Men who had learned from him began teaching others. The knowledge spread in widening circles, carried by word of mouth and handwritten pages, and the physical evidence of shelters that survived winters that killed conventional houses. Elias grew from a frightened 6-year-old into a young man who could dig a proper drainage trench and cut a proper wall angle without being told. He married a girl from the Hansen family in 1897 and built his own shelter on a claim 3 miles south. Marit remarried in 1893. A widower named Christiansen who had lost his first wife to the influenza and needed someone to help raise his children. She moved to his claim but visited often, always checking on the house that had kept her alive through that first terrible winter. Peter and Anna had 2 children of their own, a girl named Ragna, after Peter's mother, and a boy named August, after the man who had taught Peter to listen to the ground. The children grew up in the sunken house. They played in the room that had been called a grave and a hole and a cellar. They learned to read the earth the way other children learn to read books, looking for the signs of good drainage, the angles of stable walls, the subtle warnings that indicated where water would flow when the snow melted. Silas Rourke left the district in 1894. His business had never recovered from the shift in building practices. Fewer families needed the lumber he sold. Fewer families took the credit he offered. The market for emergency supplies dried up as people learned to prepare for winters instead of being caught by them. He sold his yard to a man from Omaha and moved to Kansas City. Pater heard years later that he had started another business there, selling something else to people who did not know any better. The hostile skeptic had not been converted. He had simply been made irrelevant. The community had moved past him, and he had followed the money to somewhere new. It was not the satisfying ending Pater had imagined during those cold nights when Rourke's threats had felt like walls closing in. But it was an ending. The man who had called his house a grave was gone, and the house was still standing. Ezra Bell died in 1900, outliving everyone's expectations. He was 83 years old. He had spent his last decade as a kind of elder statesman of the district, the man people consulted when they wanted to know what the winters had been like before the railroad, before the sod houses, before the homesteaders arrived. Pater visited him the week before he died. "You changed things," Bell said. His voice was thin, but his eyes were still sharp. "When you dug that pit, I thought you were a fool. I told you that you would freeze your sister and her boy from the floor up. You did. I was wrong. I've been wrong about many things in my life, but that is the one I remember most." He shifted in his bed. "The floor was not cold. The earth was not cold. You understood something I did not understand even after 20 years on this prairie. I understood because Kroll taught me, and because I had no other choice. That is how most understanding comes, through teaching and through necessity." Bell closed his eyes. "The ground remembers. That is what Kroll said, yes? That is what he said. I think he was right. The ground remembers everything we do to it, and sometimes, if we are lucky, we remember too." He died 3 days later. By 1910, the sunken house method had spread across 6 counties. Pater did not build shelters anymore. His hands were too stiff, his back too weak. But he still taught. He still walked claims with young men who wanted to know where to dig. He still answered questions about drainage and banking and ventilation. Anna's notebooks had been printed properly now, typeset and bound and sold through mail order catalogs. They cost $1.50, and the money went to a fund that helped new homesteaders get started. The fund had paid for 17 shelters by the time Pater stopped counting. The knowledge had taken on a life of its own. It no longer depended on him. It would survive when he did not. Pater Lunde died in the winter of 1918 at the age of 62. The influenza took him. The same sickness that was sweeping across the world, killing millions, found its way to a small claim in Custer County, Nebraska, and claimed a man who had survived storms that killed his neighbors. He was buried on the claim in a plot he had chosen years before. The grave faced east, toward the sunrise. Anna placed a simple stone with his name and dates and a single line beneath. He listened to the ground. Ragna and August carried on. They taught their own children. The shelters multiplied. The method spread. 30 years after Pater dug his first pit, more than 200 families in Nebraska alone were living in houses built partly underground. The numbers were not recorded officially. No one counted. But the shelters were there, visible from any high point, low roofs nearly level with the grass, stovepipes pushing smoke into the winter sky, families warm inside while the wind howled above them. The blizzard still came. The cold still killed. But fewer people died than had died before. That was the legacy. Not fame, not fortune, just fewer graves and more families making it to spring. On the night Peter died, the temperature outside was 17 degrees below zero. The wind was rising and snow was beginning to fall. The conditions were not as bad as January 12th, 1888, the day the storm had tried to kill everyone on the prairie, but they were bad enough. Inside the sunken house, the fire burned low in the stove. Anna sat beside the bed where Peter's body lay, waiting for the fever to release him. Ragnar was there, and August, and Elias, who had come as soon as he heard. The earth walls held back the cold. The temperature inside stayed above freezing. Ezra Bell had said it more than 30 years before. Keep your sister and that boy in a half-buried shack if you want, but when the real cold hits, you will freeze them from the floor up. He had been wrong. The floor was the warmest part of the house. The earth held the heat. The children, and later the grandchildren, had always slept nearest the ground where the temperature was steadiest, where the cold could not reach. Peter had understood something that Bell had not understood, that Rourke had not understood, that most people who came to the prairie never understood. The land was not an enemy to be defeated. It was a partner to be listened to. A difficult partner, stubborn and unforgiving, but a partner nonetheless. The cabin had not stood above the prairie long enough to win against it, so he had made the prairie itself hold the line, and it had held. Through that first desperate winter, through the storm that killed people in proper houses, through 30 more years of cold and heat and rain and drought, the ground remembered. And now so did everyone who had learned from the man who had listened to it.